She was the first women's studies coordinator at California State University, Chico. She's the author of 20 books, and we'll be talking about several of those today. At my end, this interview really began almost a decade ago. Gayle arranged a trip for a small group of Chicoans to northern India. Susan, Tchudi, and I were on that trip along with a wonderful woman from Canada. And we had a great tour guide, Dalbir Singh, with whom we've remained in contact. Susan and I interviewed him just recently on our Ecotopia program. There, she was interviewing young people while we were off partying and sightseeing. She was meeting with school kids, asking them questions about what they were doing. And that approach has led to several of her books, including ones I'd like to ask her about today: Climate Girls Saving the World, How Global Youth Values Will Transform Our Future, and Brave, the Young Women's Global Revolution. So after that introduction, welcome, Gayle Kimball.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Steve. I just want to say that it became a joke in India because our guide, who's open to new people right now, I must say, would say, yes, I see global youth. And then we'd find some teenagers on the street near a school, and we'd go up and he'd introduce, this is Dr. Gayle Kimball. and we'd have a nice conversation. So it became kind of a joke. It was fun.
He was great too, and he struggled through COVID. Business was down, but he's recovering now and is eager to take clients. We could recommend him without qualification. So,
absolutely.
Let us know. Yeah, if you're looking for time in India. We were northern India for the most part, and I still have the bottom half of the country that I would like to see one of these days. But your books with interviews with young people cover a rich variety of topics. Please tell us how you got started on that whole project and a little more about the full dimensions of what you've been doing over the past 10, maybe more years.
Well, all my books, I realized that I didn't set this out with intention, but they've all been about representing unheard voices. So I've done books on egalitarian couples, women's culture, and then these youth books, because I did a book called Ageism and Youth Studies, because I was really surprised to find out that even youth studies books, scholars, they didn't talk to youth. And I was stunned. They would maybe have questionnaires. How much tobacco do you smoke? You know, do you engage in sexual intercourse? But they didn't really interview youth. So I felt like this leaves out an understanding of what's really going on. An example of that is there's increasing rates of anxiety and depression among young people around the world and in the US. So a scholar like Jean Twenge at UC San Diego says it's because of the cell phone, it's because of the internet. People feel anxious because other people look better or more popular on social media. And she thinks that's the main thing because it's based on her large surveys of like college fresh persons and that kind of thing. But when you talk to youth, I think it's much bigger than that. It's that they feel so much pressure. And all the teenagers that I talk to don't get to bed before midnight at the earliest because they're doing activities after school. Maybe a third of American teens are working after school. They have huge homework loads if they want to get into a good college and show that they've taken advanced placement courses. So I think they're anxious, not so much because of social media, but because of the pressures to succeed in such a competitive, difficult society as we have now. So I started.
I would certainly agree. You know, I'll let you continue, particularly about the pressure to get into college. While people are on the one hand doubting the value of college education, there's this enormous pressure to get it not only into college, but into the old guard prestige schools like Stanford, Michigan, Yale, Harvard. Which in turn leaves those institutions all too free to continue in outmoded traditions and kind of classical education that doesn't necessarily help people nowadays. But I digress. Please continue where you were.
So whenever I travel, which is lucky being a teacher, you always have summers to explore the world. I would visit schools, just hop in and start interviewing. And over the course of those kind of travels and contacts with teachers who came like to Chico State for a summer program from around the world, I acquired about 80 teachers who gave my 12 questionnaire to their students. And the reason that I can criticize other people's questionnaires is because they're multiple choice, and none of my questions are multiple choice. So it gave them options to really say what they want to think. And so I ended up surveying over 4,000 young people from 88 countries. And that resulted in the book you mentioned about youth values, ageism and youth studies, Brave, which is a 2-volume book about young women's activism and issues. And I think one of the most interesting findings from those set, which were Gen Y, millennials, and now I've done more recent work with Gen Z, is that they're really altruistic. People think of young people as selfish, narcissistic, just concerned about their own identity formation. But when I asked them, what are your career choices? The top ones, all but 4 were altruistic: medical professional, business, not altruistic, teacher, do good, social work, counseling. Those were the top. And then when I asked them about this was a great question, I must say. If you could ask a question of the wisest person on the planet, what would you ask her or him? And those answers were altruistic. They said, I would ask, how can I do good works, make the world better? Some said, how can I achieve my personal goals? But a lot said, how can I help my family and my country? How can I best worship God? And Muslim students were more likely to mention devotion to God. And then another interesting finding, I think, from those 4,000 surveys and interviews was that there weren't distinct gender differences. So there were very few differences between boys and girls in terms of what they said. I divided them by region, and I divided them by kids and teenagers. And there were differences between kids and teenagers that you would expect. Like the kids were more concrete. They wouldn't ask what happens after death, which surprised me how many questions there were about that. What's the afterlife? Is there heaven? The kids were more likely to say, can I fly? How big is the universe? How did the earth start? They asked more concrete, specific, physical kind of questions. And then the teens were more capable of abstract, philosophical kind of questions. So I think those were the 2 findings that jumped out at me, is that no gender differences of importance, of course, differences between the thinking of kids and teens. And then the third one would be that the differences between young people today because of internet culture is not what country they live in, but rather they're urban or rural. And you've traveled a lot. Maybe you can back me up. It's the urban kids around the world have a kind of common culture. I have pictures in the book of like a boy from Rio de Janeiro, and you can't tell where he's from. He's holding a skateboard. He's got on baggy pants. He's got on a t-shirt with some kind of logo in English, some kind of brand name thing. So but the rural kids, totally different story. Many of them don't have contact with the internet. They don't have access to cell phones, or maybe just the family does, or just the village does. Is that your experience as well?
I don't have a lot of experience. So I just want to follow up. So your sense is that the internet, despite the problem you mentioned earlier, that people are attributing depression to the cell phone, it's also that the internet is opening up life for the urban kids, gives them a more homogeneous view of the world. I would certainly support that. It's the rural kids that I don't know very well.
Right.
Wanted to ask you about I was interested in your comment that the boys and girls values are more homogeneous. For a long time, we thought, oh, boys are raised to be rowdies, toughs, and so forth. And there's been appropriate praise for women's values, and I wish that we could move the world closer toward the kinds of values that women espouse. How do you think the boys are moving in their values? Where are they getting the values that you found were somewhat similar to what the young women were saying?
I have a couple of thoughts. One is that women politicians around the world are in fact shown to be more concerned about family leave and childcare and those kind of services that make life more doable. So that's a fact that women legislators are more concerned about those kind of issues, probably partly because they experience them more. They have a double job of managing the home and earning money and being legislators or whatever. And then what I found, though, is that I wrote this book that you mentioned, Climate Girls Saving Our World. And the girls, the 54 girls that I interviewed, said that they think there still are gender differences. And this is one of the most recent books. So this is very recent. And the gender difference, I think you'll find interesting. What they said is girls are more willing to be weird, to be the climate activist weird girl who's hugging trees or whatever. And that they felt like the boys in high school, not like men in their 20s, but teen boys, are much more reluctant to take a stand on an environmental issue that's seen as avant-garde or weird is the word that they use.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of like Black Lives Matter has been led by Black women, especially queer Black women. So that's been the most active recent youth movement in the last few years, since like 2013, 2014. But another really recent youth-led social movement that we hear a lot about today is the Parkland students in Florida, who 2014 Valentine's Day had that huge slaughter. The angry young man, our typical shooter, angry young man, came into school and just mowed down teachers and students. So most of their leaders are young men, like David Hogue is a person you hear a lot about, who made it into Harvard. But there was a young woman, Miss Gonzalez, who got a lot of publicity, made a very emotional speech that got a lot of coverage. So I think when young men and young women are touched by a tragedy, a trauma that they experience, it doesn't matter their gender. So they care. And I think those are the most active youth movements today, are Black Lives Matter, gun control, Hispanics, Latinos, Latinx fighting for DACA have been really active. And now I'm sure I haven't really heard an upswelling yet, but there's going to be, I'm sure, a young feminist uprising against all the denial of access to abortion. I think that's going to be the next big trend movement.
Susan and I interviewed about Climate Girls Saving Our World a couple of years ago. I wonder if you could give listeners an example or several of the kinds of projects these kids were were launching. I was very impressed with how they're implementing their activism.
The contemporary youth movement since the global climate environmental movement, I think you can kind of trace that back to the big event against capitalism, neoliberalism was in Seattle, the big uprising
World
there.
Trade. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, against the World Trade meeting and that kind of thing. So that was a big one. But since 2011, their tactic has been a new one, which is internet hashtag activism, which we've mentioned, which allows for support, information sharing around the world. So they learn, okay, if police tanks are coming at you, spray paint the windows so they can't see out. If they tear gas you, use milk or water. And those kind of tactics for how you deal with police violence are spread around the world and used around the world. And the idea started in Tahrir Square in Cairo in 2011. And by the way, I was there and interviewed some young people, young men and a young village woman who came up from the south of Egypt. She cared so much about it. And those videos and all the others are on my YouTube channel. So if people are interested in hearing the actual voices of youth, just go to search Gayle Kimball YouTube and you'll see them. And I also have lots of photos on my Facebook page of Global Youth and a lot of articles on a WordPress Global Youth blog site. So the new thing that they've done is these long-term occupations. Like in the US, we had Occupy Wall Street. And so before there would be large demonstrations, but they didn't camp out. So these tent cities are a new tactic that youth led. And what they tried to do was not take over government, but to be prefigurative, to show a new way of being. It's democratic. And this has been a double-edged sword because they tried very hard not to have stars, identifiable media leaders. They wanted to be non-hierarchical, have flat organizing structures, achieve decisions by consensus. But the sad thing is, even in Tunisia, which was the bright light of the move towards democracy after the rebellion against and ousting the dictators, which they succeeded in doing, even Tunisia now has a takeover by a strong man. So I think the goal of non-hierarchy, consensus decision-making, real democracy, everybody's voice is heard, is a nice ideal, but it didn't work. It hasn't worked anywhere really in terms of bringing the structural democracy that they would have liked to have seen.
I want to get you to elaborate on that or maybe qualify a little more. When you say it hasn't worked, it would be it hasn't worked because the traditional forces were more powerful than consensus building and the youth movement. Does that mean one should abandon those strategies of consensus, the kind of new age is the wrong word, the emerging view of how to get things done?
I think that we can learn from the pendulum swing, and maybe the pendulum went too far towards we don't want any leaders, structure, hierarchy. Well, a long time ago in the 60s, a feminist named Jo Freeman wrote a classic article called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And she said to pretend there's no structure doesn't work because there is an unspoken and maybe unknowledged structure of people who have more time or more skills or more money or more authority or whatever, there does tend to be a hierarchy. So
Mhm.
I think that the pendulum went too far in terms of consensus and too far away from we need a structure, we need a plan, we need a strategy. And I think what you hear in organizing now is that you have to have a plan, a strategy, long-term goals. You can't just do we love you and this is we're all Black or we're all feminists or whatever. In identity politics isn't enough to make real social change. And what they want to change is neoliberal capitalism that brings about
Mhm.
inequality. And that was the slogan, we're the 99%, we're not the 1%. We want the 99% to have power. So there has to be kind of a melding of what makes the military work, which is planning, structures, strategy, and real democracy where everyone's voice is considered. And personally, I don't like long meetings where everyone is allowed to talk and ramble on and monologue and
Yes,
whatever.
yes.
So I don't like that. I personally like to have a meeting where there's goals and time frameworks. I was involved in a feminist men's group called National Organization of Men Against Sexism, and they operated their meetings very effectively by having that kind of structure, but they also had people check in about their emotional feeling and do evaluation at the end and
Mhm.
that kind of thing. So no, I'm not giving up hope, but I think that it went too far. There needs to be a melding.
We've obviously gotten to your book, Resist: Goals and Tactics for Changemakers. You've hinted at a couple of them. We need strategies, structures, and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about that book? What are some of the kinds of tactics that you recommend? And what do you suggest obviously, you're suggesting be cautious about consensus building or loosey-goosey meetings with nobody in charge. But let's get into some of the tactics and strategies that you think are demonstrably working and can work for the future.
Well, I think it's important not to just have theory, but to have role models, to have examples. And when you look around the world for the most egalitarian systems, I think it's fair to say it's the Scandinavian countries. And the Scandinavian countries make a point to not have very rich or very poor people. And they are committed to providing free healthcare, good childcare, elder care, college tuition. You don't pay college tuition. So they legislate and are willing to pay taxes for those high taxes for those kind of social programs. And it works. And they consistently show up, like Finland over and over is the happiest country in the world when they do surveys of how the people actually feel. And the US is, I don't know, 15th or 14th or something like that. We're not especially happy country. So unbridled capitalism, it isn't really capitalism anyway, because it's not really free market. There's monopolies and all kinds of government subsidies for oil companies and that kind of thing. So the goal of the tactics is to arrive at a country where people are happy and well cared for, like Scandinavia. And they don't have those problems of so many people anxious and depressed, and they're happier. And then the other tactic is that's used nowadays is, of course, #activism. And some people criticize that and say, okay, then it's just clicktivism. So I signed a petition on moveon.org, so I'm done. No. So for example, the Parkland students who are lobbying for gun control, their tactics were big social media use. I get emails from them all the time asking for money. And other tactics they used were being in the face of politicians. They confronted like the Florida senators in debates after the shooting at their school, and confronted them in terms of their connection with the American Rifle Association, called them on it. So they've done a lot of investigative work and publicity about the corruption in the ARA. And I think that's made an impact. So they do traditional tactics of lobbying your politician. And what former staffers of Congress people said, what really works is you got to focus on your congressperson. Don't be thinking you can influence too much someone in another state or area. They care about your vote because your vote has count. So they emphasize lobbying your congressperson, going after the bad guys with publicity about their corruption. Of course, demonstrations, rallies, visiting the White House. So in some ways, the tactics aren't that new, but they're just, I would say, bolder and more use of social media. And they're not afraid as young people to challenge authority, which is kind of interesting, because some of the older civil rights leaders criticize young Black Lives Matter leaders for not dressing properly, you know, having low slung pants, being vulgar, swearing, cussing, you know, having rap music as part of their scene with swearing. So I think the tone has changed, that young people are more impatient and they're more willing to stand up to authority and not be so cowed to it, or not so I don't think they respect authority because the world is so messed up. Whereas earlier generations, even of civil rights leaders, were more respectful of elders and authority and that kind of thing. They're not, because we've messed things up.
Yes, and wanted to sort of ask on what are tactics that you found people are avoiding at this point?
Well, you know, we haven't had any of those long-term tent city occupations, which I think is interesting. They kind of died out. I'm trying to think. Another tactic that young people use that is, I think, fairly new is humor and joking and having fun.
Maybe even satire.
Yeah, satire. For example, one of the early youth-led revolutionary movements was in Serbia, and a group called Otpor, I don't know how you pronounce it, OTPOR, in 2000, they did things like they had a barrel with a picture of the dictator on the outside of the barrel, and you could put in money and beat the barrel as it rolled down the street. So I think the kind of use of, as you say, satire, joking, humor, poking fun at people is new. And another tactic that's new that civil rights leaders have pointed out, like Angela Davis, is it used to be like verboten to talk about your personal needs for self-care or your mental health status or that kind of thing. But among young people, and Angela Davis has called this out, then they recognize, oh yeah, it's okay to say I'm totally burned out. I need to take a break for a month or whatever it is. Or, you know, I'm suffering from anxiety and I need some support from the group, or I need to talk about it or whatever. So that's those new tactics, humor, joking, satire. But what they're not using that youth did until recently was the tent cities. And I'm not sure why. Maybe because it invites police confrontation. So it's
yes,
easier
right.
kind of.
Well, in these days, tent cities are easily confused with homeless issues. So I can see where people don't want to be rousted as if they were homeless people, because we know how our cities handle that group. I want to get kind of your personal take. You've been working on this a long time. What is your sense of optimism or pessimism that the current group of young people, at whatever age you want to discuss, can and will make a difference and really will transform the world that they're going to inherit from us, we who've screwed it up?
The Pew Research Institute has done a lot of good survey work, and Harvard also has an institute that surveys youth political attitudes. And what all those surveys find is that young people, Gen Y, Gen Z, are more liberal. So people who are friends of mine who are worried about the rise of the Trumpians and the evangelicals who are behind Trump, even though he's immoral and a liar and whatever else, that these young people are liberals. So as they get older and more of them vote, I think they won't vote for the people who are don't understand the Constitution and don't understand separation of power and who actually believe in democracy. And then personally, my grandson is 11, and what I see with his peers is they don't think in terms of color, gender, class distinctions. They're very egalitarian, and they're used to women and girls in leadership positions, that kind of thing. They don't like labels. I try to get my grandson to say, okay, you are with this group of people, how would you identify them? Or how would you identify the other groups that eat together? And she said, we don't do labels. We don't like labels, no. So they're a really egalitarian generation. And also, this young people are a majority people of color. So they experience discrimination and inequality firsthand. So I am assuming they were going to be more interested in real democracy and egalitarianism. So I'm hopeful because of that.
We just have a couple minutes left, Gayle Kimball. Where is your research taking you next? What will your next 20 books be about?
I just did a book on on masculinity. I was interested in men's views about equality and gender roles. So I did a book where I interviewed men who are involved in the men's movement or who had interesting perspectives. I did a recent book on happy marriages with long-term relationships because that interested me. And right now I'm interviewing young feminists from around the world for a book on young global feminists. So that, and all of these interviews are on my YouTube channel. So if people are interested in a firsthand look, they can go to the YouTube channel.
I was about to go there. You've got also a web page, a list of 21st century uprisings. You've got your YouTube channel. You do articles on WordPress. Any other resources that you can share with our listeners this morning?
People can always email me, gkimball@csuchico.edu, and I do a monthly radio show for KZFR, as you mentioned at the beginning, called Ask Dr. Gayle, the second Thursday of each month from 6 to 7. So if people have topics they want to discuss, they can email me and let me know what they'd like to explore.
My guest has been Gayle Kimball. Thank you, Gayle, for being on the Peace and Justice and Social Justice program this morning. You're just